At the end of the Second World War, Europe's borders changed quite a lot, but it wasn't the first time.
First time?
In fact, in 1919, following the Treaty of Versailles, Germany in particular had many of its border territories given to several existing and several new states, something I talked about when this channel was still in its infancy. Now, the Netherlands wasn't one of the big players in the Second World War. It was invaded in 1940 by the Germans, and after about a week of resistance, the army surrendered and the Queen fled to England, there to continue the fight with several of the soldiers that made it over the Channel, those being involved fighting alongside the British at D-Day and in other various engagements, as well as against the Japanese in Asia, particularly in their colony of the Dutch East Indies, as it was then. However, in 1945, the Allies would liberate the Netherlands, and after the feeling of jubilation at being liberated from several years of German occupation, there were also some darker feelings mixed in, feelings of revenge. Some of this was against the Dutch population who had collaborated with the Germans. Others were against those German soldiers, and particularly SS members who the Dutch could get their hands on, who were forced to clear minefields. In 1946, the German civilian population was targeted. In Operatie Zwarte Tulp, or Operation Black Tulip, the vijandelijke onderdanen, or hostile subjects in the Netherlands, that being some 25,000 German citizens in the Netherlands, were targeted for deportation. In the end, only 3,691, or about 15% of the German population living in the Netherlands, were actually deported. However, there was a lot of angry feeling against Germany because of what had happened in the war. In particular, the 1944 Hungerwinter, or Hunger Winter, a famine that was exacerbated by the Germans following a Dutch rail strike that had happened in connection with the Allied attack in Operation Market Garden, meant that around 20,000 people starved to death and many millions went without food for the winter, suffering health problems for the rest of their lives, my grandparents included. This, as well as the fact that the Netherlands had been bombed and occupied, many of its ports sabotaged by the Germans and also by the Allies during the fighting, meant that the Netherlands was in a pretty bad economic state in 1945, as well as the fact that they would soon be embroiled in a conflict known as the Politionele Acties in their colony of the Dutch East Indies. That meant that in 1945, the Dutch government decided to ask the Germans for reparations to the tune of
$100 billion.
or 25 billion guilders. Now, they knew already they weren't going to get this in monetary form. This had been decided at the Yalta Conference, one of the lessons learned from the Treaty of Versailles and the reparations. So the Dutch decided there was perhaps another way that Germany might pay them back in kind, or actually in land rather than in cash, and this is the Bakker-Schut plan, named after the Dutch civil servant Frits Bakker-Schut. He was clearly having a particularly good time in Amsterdam because this plan is absolutely nuts when you go into it. Basically, the plan was something concocted by several Dutch government committees. One was the Dutch Committee for Territorial Expansion, another the State Commission for the Study of the Annexation Question, and the Study Group for Territorial Expansion, who came together in the years following the war and decided that the reason the Netherlands was lagging behind was because Germany owed them big time in terms of land, and this was the only way that they could be repaid for what had gone wrong in the war. The Bakker-Schut plan, as suggested by the Rijksdienst voor het Nationale Plan, came back to the government with 3 different plans, one of very ambitious scope and 2 of slightly reduced scope. The most ambitious plan saw several large German cities such as Münster, Cologne and Aachen become part of the Netherlands, as well as around 41 border regions. A slightly reduced version of this plan would ignore those larger cities but still have a large belt surrounding the Dutch border, and an even more reduced version would see incorporated into the Netherlands those bordering regions of Ostfriesland and a belt down the Rhineland. Now, why on earth was this plan suggested? Well, first was as reparations, because the Dutch realized they weren't going to receive financial reparations from the Germans anytime soon, so they thought, we'll take a bit of land. There was a lot of Dutch animosity towards Germany and a certain desire to have a degree of payback. Perhaps this was that opportunity. Now, of course, this seems ridiculous when thinking about Western Europe, but at the same time, the very same thing was happening in Eastern Europe. Around half to a third of current Polish territory was German territory before the war. Of course, bearing in mind that this had been Polish for several centuries before that, and the population was incredibly mixed between Poles and Germans, not to mention several other ethnic groups. The same cannot be said for those regions being claimed by the Dutch, however. The vast majority of people there were German and spoke either Low German or German as a first language, and so it's quite a different situation. However, this was enough for Dutch politicians to suggest the plan. There was some historical precedent for a Dutch rule over parts of what they were claiming, particularly parts of the region of Ostfriesland. Of course, the Dutch have their own Frisian minority in the province of Friesland, and in 1806, when the Netherlands was ruled by Napoleon, the Kingdom of Holland was actually granted Ostfriesland as part of its territory. However, following the end of Napoleonic rule, that was overturned and they were separated once again. Although today in Emden, you can still see traces of the Dutch past in its cathedral there. Another factor that the Dutch were relying on was the fact that most people in Ostfriesland and several of these border regions spoke Low German, dialects of a language that were very close to other dialects of the same language in the Netherlands, particularly in areas like Groningen and the eastern Netherlands. So across the border they were able to communicate in the same language, a language which was somewhat closer to Dutch than it was to German. And the Dutch government hoped that this would make it easy to assimilate them into speaking Dutch rather than German. However, this plan was not unanimously agreed upon in Dutch society and in the Dutch government. In general, Catholics and more conservatives were in favour of the plan. Conservatives because it would enhance the power and prestige of the Netherlands, and Catholics because most of the areas that would be incorporated into the Netherlands were majority Catholic, and so it would mean that Catholics would make up a majority of the Netherlands. However, the socialists and the liberals were largely against this plan to incorporate so many Germans into the Netherlands. It also hinged a lot on the fact that there were obviously millions of Germans living there, and of these, the majority would be deported. Others would be given a chance to either accept Dutch citizenship. They could do this by showing that either they were a speaker of Low German as their main language instead of High German, or that they had actively sought to help the Netherlands in the Second World War. The rest would be forced to leave, and the rest would be populated with Dutch citizens. Yeah. Something about having Lebensraum in the East. This is a very uncomfortable suggestion, and clearly the lessons from several years earlier had not been learned at this point, so you can see why it made many people in the government uncomfortable to suggest such a plan. That included the Dutch Prime Minister Wim Schermerhorn. However, the Queen Wilhelmina was an ardent supporter of the Bakker-Schut plan, and so the government came with something of a compromise. In 1946, they laid official claim on 4,980 square kilometers of German territory, largely in Ostfriesland and several other border regions, which was home to around 550,000 Germans that were living there. They might have claimed it, but they had to wait for permission which in 1947 was granted by the Allied High Commission. Those are the British, the French and the Americans, and they allowed the Dutch to annex this region of Germany. It became part of the Greater Netherlands, and the dreams of the Burgundians were finally fulfilled. Yeah, that straight up just didn't happen. The Allied High Commission basically said,
How about no, you crazy Dutch bastard?
and told them to Bakker-Schut it down. That was terrible. The reason being that there were already some 14 million displaced German refugees coming into Western Germany, particularly those who had been ousted from territory that would now belong to Poland, as well as several other emerging countries in Eastern Europe. What was happening was that German minorities, some of whom had lived there already for centuries, were either being forced out or had already fled in the wake of the Red Army in the dying years of the Second World War. And so this contributed to millions and millions of people, ethnic Germans and Germans that were coming into Western Germany. Many of these Volksdeutsche had actively supported the Germans, supported the Nazis during the war, but others had been caught in a very uncomfortable position where really they weren't able to deny the Germans that were coming into countries, many of them having been there for centuries, and so then they were scapegoated following the end of the Second World War. Some of these so-called Germans were actually a whole mix of different Germanic-speaking peoples, many of whom had left Germany already in the 17th or 18th centuries, but they were still sent packing to Germany. And so the Allied High Command decided that now was not the time to be getting even more refugees coming from some crazy Dutch annexation plan of Western Germany. It's also true that in 1947, Germany was still in ruins, and the Americans and the other allies more generally wanted a strong, resurgent Germany that would stand up in the face of Soviet aggression across in East Germany as it would become, and the developing Warsaw Pact bloc. By further dividing Germany and giving a large part of it to the Netherlands, this would help to destabilize and weaken Germany, and instead they decided that it was better to just shelve this plan. So that was it. The Netherlands didn't get any German territory, and Bakker-Schut never got what he wanted.
But not for long!
In 1949, following the London Conference, Dutch troops mass on the German border, and with one fell swoop at around noon, they cross and they annex part of Germany. The border posts are changed. The Netherlands has done it. The Bakker-Schut plan, has it come to fruition? Will Germany greatly be reduced in size and the Netherlands take a huge bite out of its neighbour's territory? No, not exactly. The Netherlands have taken over around 69 square kilometres of German territory, a lot of it quite uninhabited. That's around 10,000 people that will now be added into the Netherlands. Hardly anyone is deported, and a few Dutch signposts are hung up. The main inhabited areas being taken over were Elten, Selfkant, which is normally referred to by its largest village of Tudern in German, which then became the Dutch place Dudderen. There was also Suderwijk, which is bordering with a Dutch town on the other side of the border, which became the Dutch Zuiderwijk. However, it didn't really last very long. In 1957, the German government, the West German government as it was then, started to negotiate with the Netherlands about getting back this territory. And in 1960, they reached a deal that in 1963, the territories would be handed back to the West German government for 280,000 Deutsche Mark, which is about 143,000 euros in today's money. It's fair to say that the inhabitants were relieved to become German again and not have to deal with eating cheese and bread every lunchtime.
There are only two things I can't stand in this world. People who are intolerant of other people's cultures and the Dutch.
What?
One exception of territory that wasn't handed back to the Germans was the Devilsberg, known in German as the Teufelsberg or the Devil's Mountain, a nature reserve of around 3 kilometers squared that the Nijmegen politician who lived nearby, Marinus van der Goes van Naters, insisted that the Dutch government kept and was successful. So technically the total ground that the Netherlands won in World War II was 3 kilometers squared territorial change. Another interesting case is the case of the road, the N274, which is highlighted in green there at the bottom. Now, it looks like it disappears into Germany, but the road keeps going. And for the longest time, this road was part of the Netherlands because it was looked after by the Rijkswaterstaat, the Dutch Highway Commission, and there were no turning off points into Germany. You can only drive from the Netherlands to the Netherlands and back on this one road, even though it is in Germany. This state of affairs was changed in 2002 when the road was officially handed back to the Germans, and they renamed it L410 as part of the broader roads, and you can now drive off that road onto other roads into Germany. A little post-war example of cross-border shenanigans following World War II between the Netherlands and Germany. Now let me know in the comments below, because I think it might be fun, if people have enjoyed this video, to do a little what if. What if this Bakker-Schut plan had actually been accepted by the Allies? Let's say someone answered the wrong telegram and they decided, okay, this can go ahead. What would history have looked like? What would the Netherlands have looked like in terms of its demographics, and Germany? What would the place names be in this new area? The Dutch had drawn up a whole list. So there's definitely more that I can say about this if you are interested in such a video being made. Now, if you are new to the channel, check out some of my other videos about the history of the Netherlands and the history of Germany. I've got quite a few videos stacked up at this point about them. And let me know in the comments below if you enjoyed it, any more information about this, and any other videos you'd like to see in the future. Huge thank you to the patrons for making it possible for me to continue making videos, and I will see you all in the next one. I have been Hilbert, and this has been The History. Auf Wiedersehen.